Bit do-it-yourself here, moderating / talking. So I'm Brad Johnson, wetland riparian ecologist with Johnson Environmental Consulting. And I will be talking to you today about maximizing ecological outcomes in stream design, lessons learned from the 2013 flood recovery monitoring. Or as I like to call it, the FIA and you, because this is all about design and how to incorporate ecological considerations into your stream design. Okay, so I have to go back to the 2013 flood recovery. Oh, before I say that, I am going to be echoing quite a few things that other people have talked about over the last couple days, and hopefully it won't be redundant. I'm going to come at it from a little different perspective. So I'm going to be looking at the 2013 flood recovery. So I have to go back there. It's almost a decade now. Some people are still kind of getting over the PTSD, but of course we had the 2013 floods along the Front Range, devastated quite a few of our streams. We had, amongst other efforts, the Emergency Watershed Protection, or EWP program, come in, dump about $60 million or more into these flood recovery projects. This was just one effort of several. Something weird happened, though, when most of these projects were built. CWCB, under the leadership of Chris Sturm, said, hey, we want to see what the outcomes of these projects are. Some of the things that we've heard today. You can't just walk away. You can't just walk away. So he actually wanted to look at outcomes, but he didn't want to look at any outcomes. He actually wanted to look at ecological outcomes. And that was something really different. I'll talk more about that in just a second. So, of course, okay, as we've been hearing, all roads lead to ecometrics. And this is no exception. So ecometrics got tapped to be the prime on this project, and then Kim Lemberg and I, Kim Lemberg from Alba, I should say her company name, and I came in and we helped out. We monitored 23 projects. These were big projects, oftentimes, not all of them. But it was really super interesting because we were looking at contiguous projects that were designed using totally different techniques by totally different firms, all this hodgepodge of all these different techniques. This is like, you know, all hands on deck to get these things built. So everybody who they could possibly recruit kind of was in on the mix. So we monitored these projects from 2017 to 2019, and we had a really good time doing it. Whenever possible, we would stay at the 11th Aero Squadron cabin in Estes Park. This is actually a, whoops, hold on. This is actually World War I ACE themed cabin. I didn't even know they existed. And here's Mark Beardsley himself imitating the beloved mascot of the 11th Aero Squadron. The only difference that I can tell between Mark and the mascot in the background is that the mascot is carrying a bomb and Mark is carrying a box of empty beer cans. We did have fun on this trip. Anyways, on the many trips. So back to the monitoring. We put together a database, 2018. We put together a methods report, and we continued monitoring for another year. But about at the same time, Jeff Sickles and Katie Yott and Mike Blazewicz put together this really cool book. Whoops, I'm going to do that probably the whole talk. Because I wanted to use my pointer, but I have to hold this dumb microphone in my hand instead. But put together this awesome book, the Colorado Disaster Recovery book. And it was lessons learned. And I have to say, I had a little bit of lessons learned envy. But I liked it because it challenged me to really kind of take a step back, because we were collecting numbers. And I was like, well, I've been looking at all these projects. What are my lessons learned? What from an ecological standpoint, what did I see out there? What was good? What was bad? What was ugly? And so in 2019, I sort of took this sojourn. I just looked at these sites fairly holistically. I wasn't collecting numbers at that point, but I wanted to just see what were some of the patterns that were jumping out at me. So before I get into the main part, the talk. This is a caveat slide. So I know that there are constraints on building ecologically beneficial designs. Of course, the number one and or two priorities of EWP were protection of life and property. That makes sense. The next one was a wise expenditure of public funds. And then finally, number three was, oh yeah, and if you have anything left over, try to help the ecology a bit. Try to get some ecological lift in the system. So that was the first big constraint. The other constraint was just the constraints on designs. There's tons of them. There's just this flood. There's traumatized landowners, FEMA, there's permitting, there's all these things, all into the mix of the design. None of these we knew. Absolutely none. We had no idea what the objectives of these individual projects were. So in this talk, I'm not going to mention any project names, anything like that. I don't want to be pointing fingers or anything like that. I'm just going to be focusing on techniques and approaches to restoration. Or I should say to stream design, because some of these, not so much restoration. Okay, so I'm out here, and like I said, I'm a wetland and riparian ecologist, and that's what I was looking at in these projects. And so I wasn't interested in what was happening here, and I learned that I wasn't interested in happening here, because this is all dry. That's upland. It's not riparian. It's close to the stream, yes. But what my zone is like right in here. And I kept on looking at it, and I'm like, it's always so slopey. I'm like, what is going on with this? And so this led me on this kind of journey of discovery. And I'm like, okay, so here we go. Here's this channel, obviously. Here's this dry deck up here, which is ostensibly supposed to be riparian. It's so close to the stream. But it's really not. So I had to think about this. And in order to think about this, we're going to jump back to some basic plant ecology. So the thing to realize is that vegetation changes along environmental gradients. And this is a random one. I just really like this paper. It's from Bob Peet, 1981. This is the forest vegetation of the Colorado Front Range. So just to give you an idea, of course, you have an elevation gradient here in Colorado. This is really in your face. Vegetation changes along the elevation gradient. And then you also have a moisture gradient, which is shown down here on the bottom. And these are all just the changes in vegetation that you have across. Don't worry about any of the details, just take in the concept. In wetland and riparian systems, the water table is the dominant ecological driver in 99.9% of the cases. That makes total sense probably to everybody. So if we can have a depth of the water table gradient, you can imagine there's an optimal depth of the water table, and then you can imagine at a deeper level there's going to be a depth of the water that's non-viable for wetland or riparian vegetation. Now, if you laid out a transect, you could measure the depth of the water table along that transect, and the change in the water table over the distance. If you just graph that out, this is obviously a very simple representation, but that becomes a representation of the ecological gradient. And the steeper this line is here, is the steeper the ecological gradient. That is, the faster vegetation will change, the faster the habitats will change. So what do we have here? This is representation, rough. I made all these really cartoony, and I could have done them in crayon or something like that, but I didn't want to have anybody get the impression that these might have been some sort of a serious engineering drawing or a take on it. These are just basic representations of what we're seeing out there, because we saw so many projects, there's so many variations on the theme. Okay, so what do you got here? You have this, this is supposed to be the water line, and then you have about a three foot deep channel. Up here you have, let's just say, a 5-year floodplain. It could be a 7-year, it could be a 10-year, it could be a 20-year, I really don't care. Because this is really, really dry. These are pretty much ambient Colorado conditions, semi-arid conditions, actually exacerbated by the type of soil that was oftentimes used in fill. It's very well-drained soil, so that any water that falls on it just runs right through the system. So this is what we have. Once again, this is my zone right in here, this one, sort of the 1 to 5 year riparian zone. And so what do we see? At the bottom, you have the zone of the living dead, this stuff. That's a term from Mike Scott. He's an eminent plant ecologist, geomorphologist, formerly of the USGS. He came up with that. Basically, plants can germinate in there, become established seedlings, and then the next year, flood comes in, scrubs them out. That's why there's no vegetation in there. The next zone is here, high and dry above the water table. Yeah, this would be like the outer fringes of the riparian zone, if you will. Dry, we can still consider it riparian, kind of in an extreme sense. And then finally, we have the prime riparian zone, squished in there. And, well, this made me mad, because I'm a wetland and riparian ecologist. This is, basically, they took my part and squished it down to the very bare minimum. And so what I realized is this is actually a method of ecological minimization. And why do I say it's a zone of ecological minimization? That's because the most functions in an aquatic system like this come from the, quote, floodplain, comes from the wetlands and riparian areas that flank the channel. In alluvial systems, this is the biggest part of the river system. You know, in terms of area, in terms of function. I could talk about Kluwer and Thorne papers. Everybody's been showing all these papers. That's why I don't have these figures up. But you get the most functions out of the wetlands and riparian areas. We know this. And so I saw this and I thought, okay, it's shrunk, but what's really going on here? And so, let's see, did that change? Okay. Oh, no, I jumped ahead real quick. So here's just a few examples of what I'm talking about. Here's the narrow riparian zone. This is just like, 1.5 foot, 2 feet. Here's another one. Here's Mark, again, showing how wide this one is. Here's another one in here. This is the only thing that could be considered vaguely riparian in this area. So I was like, what is going on here? Okay, let's dissect this problem. And so I'm going to go back to this ecological gradient business here. And so we have our depth to water table and the distance. And we have optimal and non-viable depths. In ecological restoration, you can call it process-based restoration. I actually would prefer just to call it restoration, but we can call it process-based restoration. What you want to do is you want to create an ecological gradient that brings the system up to the optimal conditions. Oh, hold on, I have to go back here 1 second. I'm sorry, I missed this. I knew there was a click in here that I didn't see. So what happens here, okay, sorry, I'm going to take a big jump back, but don't worry, it's not going to take any time. So if we have a situation like this with this ecological gradient in here, and if we make a basic simplifying assumption that the water table is flat off of the stream, then this gradient actually becomes a representation of the ground surface. And so if we compare it to this cartoon drawing, basically what's happened is there's this slopey section, and then right here, once we get into the non-viable area, the system is held in the non-viable zone for wetland and riparian plants. And that's what we're seeing here. It's non-viable for wetland and riparian, and it runs all the way back there into the distance. Sorry about that. So, here we go. Ecological restoration, process-based restoration. We bring the system to an optimum, and then we hold it at that optimum for absolutely as long as we can. It might not have to be flat like this, of course, this simplification. And this is how you get all these ecological functions then out of your system. So what I'm getting at here is this is the problem, and this is the problem. And the funny thing about a lot of these projects is this problem was brought in, this ecological problem was brought in at great expense because it's fill, oftentimes, in these EWP projects. And so I'm like, what is missing here? Well, It is the riparian zone, but really what it is it's missing a frequently inundated area, or at least what we've seen is a minimization of the frequently inundated area. I don't want to call it a floodplain. People get too hung up on recurrence intervals when we start talking about floodplains. So how frequently does the frequently inundated area wet up? I don't know. Frequently. Like once a year, once every other year, like Q 1.5, 1.25, 1.7, 3, I don't know. But it's enough to sustain vegetation. It's enough to generate functions. It's like we need frequently inundated areas. Let's get rid of that. So why go with frequently inundated area? You get robust vegetation, low or no irrigation needed. Processes drive the stream form. Less fill is needed. Of course, that makes it less expensive as well. Less armor is commonly needed. Again, cost savings. More functions, more ecological functions, more ecosystem services, better ecological health. And then you get system resiliency. Okay, so we're almost to the end. Not almost to the end of my talk, but we're almost to the end of the conference. I'm thankful that they didn't put me in the last spot like they usually do here for some reason. But if you want to, you can all go. These are the points that I wanted to make, and the rest of this is going to be elaboration on these points, and hopefully convincing you. Okay, now can you put a frequently inundated area in everywhere? No, absolutely not. I'm not naive. I'm not just like chasing after butterflies and bunnies because I'm an ecologist. I know that there are these times where you have to use hard protections, everything else. But the idea is put it in when you can. Every single time that you can do it. Look for those opportunities. Hunt them down. Be creative. So let's talk about this a little bit. The FIA is, how do we do it? How do we get one? Well, the FIA is most often created by minimizing channel depth. Now, well, what do I mean by that? Okay, well, if we're going back to that trapezoidal channel that I drew earlier, what I don't want to do is, I don't want to call those banks, because those really aren't banks. What's happened is that the channel has subsumed the entire riparian area, and it's made it look like it. It has basically gotten rid of the largest, arguably most important component of the system, and just built it into the channel. So it's banks, yes, but it's much more than that in that other design. So the FIA is often created by minimizing the channel depth. And that's what we see here. And so these are some of the projects that came in, and they developed their design with FIAs. And I should also just mention that a lot of these projects used a combination of approaches. Sometimes it was trapezoidal, sometimes it was more like this. Again, we don't know why they switched. We have no idea. So I'm just talking about ecological outcomes. With ecological restoration, with process-based restoration, from my standpoint, the question's how low can you go? You want to build your channel and the banks and this frequently inundated area as low as possible, in my estimation, or very close to the water surface. This is one of my favorites. This is on the Big Thompson. This thing can just be the river that it wants to be, if I can anthropomorphize. So processes can drive the formation of channel forms, banks, side channels. Maybe the channel would braid in here. We don't know. But the point is that the channel can respond to the ambient conditions in the watershed, and it can create a form that is reflective of those conditions and is hopefully resilient to those conditions. Low benches and point bars are natural configurations, and they support characteristic stream functioning. It's just incredibly important to these systems. And these are all projects that did it across the landscape. So that was one of the things I learned. because I was like, I'm not a river engineer, I'm not a river designer. And one of the things I question of myself is, can you just not do this? And all these projects gave me this insight. Yes, you can do this. If you have the space available, the freedom space, as people like to call it, you can do this, absolutely. So look at this. This is 3 years after. This is near the Big Thompson, the confluence of Big Thompson and the North Fork. This is 3 years after. From a talk earlier today, Mike Blazewicz was saying, the goal of restoration is you should come in afterwards, shortly thereafterwards, and you shouldn't be able to tell that there's a restoration that has occurred. And I would argue this is one good example of that. There can be some pushback, like, hey, we just don't have very much room. We can't build a giant, expansive floodplain. It's pie in the sky idea. Well, you don't need that. And you can imagine, for instance, like right along here, this is pretty narrow, maybe 15 feet or so wide, but you can imagine that all these willows are adding incredible roughness. The roots are holding the soil together. They are protecting this steep slope. This is kind of like an open, spacey sort of setting, so there's not any assets to protect. But you can imagine if someone's big mansion was up here, or some other asset, it would protect that equally well, just as that steep slope. The benefit of vegetation is profound. There's just absolutely no comparison. So on the right, these are pictures taken of the ground in frequently inundated, in designs with frequently inundated area. Here's some that didn't use that approach. Here's the channels, so you can see how close we are. And another thing I should mention is these were taken within like a day or two of each other. It's not a seasonal effect. Here, it's that dramatic. So you see, this is not even vegetated. Here, plantings all dead. It's because these areas were planted as if they were riparian because they were so close, but they had none of the capacity to support riparian plants. So this poor Tantalus, he's the Greek, he wasn't actually a god, but he was punished and he was put into the water up to his lip and he could never drink. And it's so close. And that's the same way with a lot of these builds. Plants are very sensitive to the amount of fill. And so if you just have just a few inches of extra fill on top, just a few, plants don't care if it's just a few. They can't get it, especially they can't get established. Maybe if they're fully established, they could grow. But here's one example that I liked. We have this nice riparian zone right here, and then a quick transition to upland grasses, and then to dirt. This is not very much fill, so maybe a total of about a foot of fill or something like that. I don't have the exact number. We do have cross sections here, so I could, but I didn't want to go there. So this is really important, being sensitive. If you build your system low, if you build in an FIA, you don't have this problem. The plants will always be able to access the water. There's no irritation with irrigation. This is expensive. Irrigation is both expensive and a pain in the ass. People have to come out. There's a lot of maintenance that goes into it. There's a lot of money. These sites, never irrigated. They're doing great. This is only about a year after, maybe that was 2 years after the build, so the vegetation isn't really super dense, but it's pretty good. This picture here, I like this. This isn't quite geomorphologically correct what I'm going to say, but just bear with me because I like the illustration. Here, this is a frequently inundated area. There's no irrigation. The plants are looking great. Here, that looks like Mark up there on this high bench. Irrigation, probably a lot of dead plants, but anyways, a lot of real brown plants. You know it's the same time of year. It's in the same picture. So that was one of the things that I came to is, you know what? If you're needing to put irrigation in areas that are ostensibly riparian, your design went haywire. There's an issue there. You shouldn't have to artificially support riparian plants in their native zone. Hey, let the river deliver. This is one of the cool things. If you develop a frequently inundated area, it's frequently inundated not just with water, but also with sediment, with fines. And so a lot of projects brought fines in. I think that's I was going to say it's a fine idea, but that's too bad. It's a great idea, and it speeds things along. It certainly does. But if you want to save some money and you want to save some diesel, and you don't want to bring a bunch of fill in yourself, just let the river do it. So here's a site. This is after one flood cycle right here. This site, no fines brought in. It's all filling in these interstitial spaces. This picture was taken like right in here or something like that. So you can see all the fines filling in these interstitial spaces. It'll only be another year or two before this fills in completely. If you have an FIA, you can maximize the functioning of your wood installations. Here, these designs didn't, and I think you can see these wood installations are not being all they could be. Here's the creek back here. Here's this root wad up high and dry. I'm sure it's doing something for biogeochemical cycling and maybe some habitat or something like that. But if you develop an FIA and you install wood treatments, all of a sudden you get hydraulic benefits. You get roughness benefits. You can do this sort of thing. This is called a brush trench. You can dig in a brush trench. Just throw a bunch of cottonwood branches, live cottonwood branches, and willows and dead cottonwood branches. It doesn't matter. Cover it up with dirt. It's going to have soil moisture. This is 2 years after construction. You can't. There's nothing for scale, which I wish there was. This is my only picture I have it. But these are 8 feet tall in 2 years. So that's a huge benefit. Resiliency. 2 minutes? Oh, all right. No, we're good. Okay, so maximizing ecological function. I was really lollygagging. That's okay. I'm almost done. Maximizing ecological function means maximizing resiliency. So you can develop a large capacity channel that dissipates flow across a well-vegetated, frequently inundated area. Armor's typically not necessary. Why is it not necessary here? Because I don't care if the channel moves. Why is it resilient? Well, because if this blows out in a high flow, I don't have to rebuild it again because I don't have anything invested in this particular channel position within the FIA. If you have a trapezoidal design, this is a resistant system. What's going to happen next? When the water finally gets out here and it gets onto this sort of floodplain deck. Look at this, it's all dirt. In a sense, these systems are designed to flood on some regular interval, but they're given no capacity to survive that flood. That's a big issue to me. And I can only imagine what's going to happen when the floods come in here. Same exact thing could be said for side channels. There's a lot of talk about installing side channels on these projects. This is a moist and resilient side channel. I would predict this. I'm not sure what's going to happen when a big flood comes ripping down this side channel. It's a lot of dirt and loose rock. I mean, I have I can imagine. So just a little bit more. I know I'm just about out of time, so I'm just going to kind of finish this off. But everything I said for the main channel can be said for side channel configurations. We saw this kind of build quite a bit with the main channel here and a deep trapezoidal channel on the side. This does not enhance floodplain connection because the water's still 4 feet below the surface of the floodplain. That's not a connected floodplain. Here's Mark. Here's the terrace. It's about up to his hip. So it's about this deep. This side channel is not going to overbank. It's not doing anything for the vegetation on the surface. Protected side channels, even kind of stranger, where here's a channel and a levee, and then a protected side channel. We saw quite a few examples of here. Here's a levee, side channel on the back of it, so on and so forth. So briefly, what do ecologically beneficial side channels do? Well, first off, they distribute water. They convey water near the surface of the land. That's really important, the near the surface part. And they bleed off energy. Yes, they do that. So a lot of the side channels were only made, as I understand it, to bleed off energy. That was their focus, and I do believe they'll do that 100%. So here's what these ecologically beneficial side channels look like. They're moist. They oftentimes have water, even at low water. These were taken in September or early October. So then conclusions. Whenever possible, say no to the groove. This is the way in which ditches are created. This is not a restorative, in a classical sense, technique. But yes, say yeah to the frequently inundated area and potentially the minor shallow side channels on the side. All right, that's it.